Shalom Havreim, James Trim here. And today I wanted to talk to you about the issue that gets raised a lot when I talk about the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the New Testament, of people that argue that the New Testament had to have been written in Greek because the oldest and most manuscripts, either the oldest and or the most manuscripts, are in Greek. And this kind of follows up on the last video where we were talking about whether the so-called New Testament quotes the Septuagint, which is often an objection that we get where somebody will say, but the New Testament quotes the Septuagint frequently, so that must mean that it was written in Greek. And we dispelled that inaccuracy in the last video, as we pointed out that while the Greek New Testament seems to at times quote, and I say seems to at times quote from the Septuagint, the Aramaic Peshitta New Testament and Old Syriac Gospels seem to quote frequently from the Peshitta Aramaic text, and the Hebrew Diuthale text of Matthew seems to frequently quote from the Masoretic text, or at least the Proto-Masoretic text. And we discovered also that sometimes a translator will, in translating from language A to language B, insert, whenever he's quoting from the scriptures, insert the standard translation of the scriptures that are being quoted as in the standard translation of language B, rather than preparing a fresh translation from A. As I pointed out, I have a book in German. It's not in German. It was originally written in German. It was translated into English, and all the scripture quotations cite the King James Version rather than translating whatever German version of those quotations were used in the original German of that book. And finally, we pointed out that the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls many Hebrew manuscripts of books of the Tanakh that followed the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. And so there were, in the Second Temple era, Hebrew manuscripts of the books of the Tanakh that followed the same text type as was the source for the Septuagint, and as opposed to the Masoretic text. And so we would expect the New Testament as a Second Temple era Judaism document, when quoting passages from the Tanakh, to have agreements with the Septuagint, which are not necessarily agreements with the Septuagint, but merely agreements with the Hebrew text that was behind the Septuagint, that was in the hand of the Septuagint translators. But in response to that, I had some people come back and say, but the oldest and we have 5,000 Greek manuscripts, of the oldest manuscripts are in Greek, etc. And so I wanted to respond to that. Before I get going, I need to ask people to please donate to support this work. Our coffers are empty. We are at virtually at zero. And we have bills coming that we need to be able to cover, so please donate to support this work. You can donate by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org, or clicking on the donate link in the video description. Rent will be due in just 10 days, and right now we don't even have funds to cover bills that are coming to us between now and then. Okay, also, please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel with your notifications on by clicking that notification bell. And please let us know what you think in the comments, and participate in the discussions in the video comments. Of course, oftentimes I get some knee-jerk reactions from people on some of these topics that haven't really even thought them through or listened to the video in depth. But we welcome your comments. We like people engaging in discussions. All right. So let's address this topic. First of all, we have to understand that the whole question of age and quantity of manuscripts of New Testament books really doesn't tell us which text is most original. It only tells us which texts were being most actively preserved, which texts were in the areas that had the most arid climate for preservation, and which texts were being copied most profusely amongst early Christians. And so let's address that topic. For example, we have something called the Masoretic text in comparison with, let's talk about the Tanakh here for a moment, or the so-called Old Testament. The Tanakh, the Hebrew text of the Tanakh that we have is called the Masoretic text. That's what's come down to us. That's the traditional Jewish text, the traditional standard text in Judaism of the Tanakh. Now, one might ask, what is the traditional Hebrew text of the Tanakh that was passed down and preserved in Christendom, as opposed to the Masoretic text, which was passed down and preserved in Judaism? Where's the Hebrew standard Hebrew text that was passed down and preserved by Christians? And the answer is there isn't one. In fact, if it wasn't for the Masoretic text, we would have lost the original Hebrew of the Tanakh. If it wasn't for Judaism and the Masoretic text, I would say, if Judaism had ceased to exist, and the Masoretic text had not been passed down and preserved, we would not have a Hebrew text of the Tanakh. We would have some portions of it that were later recently discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but even that wouldn't be complete. So the reason is that ancient Christians had no interest in the Hebrew Tanakh. They just didn't. And so as a result, they didn't preserve it, they didn't copy it, they didn't have copies of it, and they didn't care about it at all. Okay? And the evidence of that is, first of all, as I said, we don't have a standard Hebrew version of the Tanakh that was passed to us by Christendom, that by contrast to the Masoretic text that's been passed down through Judaism. Another evidence of this is that we don't find ancient Christian Hebrew manuscripts of the books of the Tanakh. For example, we have preserved to us over 100 tiny papyri fragments, known as the papyri fragments, okay, that are found almost entirely, if not entirely, in Egypt, where the climate was very hot and dry, and these kinds of fragments could survive, even then only as fragments. So we have roughly a little over 100 little papyri fragments, some of them the size of an olive, some of them the size of the palm of your hand, that have been preserved mostly, if not entirely, in ancient Egypt, where the climate was very hot and dry. And these manuscripts are all Greek. Well, there's probably, I think, some Coptic too, but they're Greek. None of them are Hebrew. Okay. Now, that is a fact that those arguing for the Greek New Testament like to tout. Because some of those tiny fragments are quite ancient. Some of them date back arguably maybe to the end of the 1st century, but probably to the beginning of the 2nd century, although most of them are later than that. Some of them actually date back that far. And they're all, they're Greek. They're not Hebrew. None of them are Hebrew. Now that, let's clarify what that means. There are some of them that are Septuagint Greek manuscripts of Old Testament books. And we know those books were written in Hebrew originally, but the ancient Christians weren't interested in the Hebrew. They were only interested in the Greek, and so that's all they preserved, and that's all they had, and that's all their Greek fragments reflect. So it makes, or it should be of no surprise to us then, that even if, and I believe it was, the New Testament was originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic, that the papyri fragments are only Greek, just like the papyri fragments of the books of the Tanakh, the books that we know were written in Hebrew, are only Greek. The fact that the oldest manuscripts are Greek does not mean that the original language was Greek. Let's talk about the Tanakh. Remember I said that we have the Masoretic text that was passed down to us in Judaism, but there's no alternate Christian Hebrew text that was passed down by Hebrew scribes amongst Christians through the centuries. It simply doesn't exist. And so, let's talk about the book of Esther. Let's not even talk about Esther. Let's talk about the whole Tanakh first. Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the 20th century, the oldest manuscripts that we had of the books of the Tanakh were Greek. They were Greek codices that of the Septuagint that were of Christian origin. Not that the Septuagint was of Christian origin, but these manuscripts were of Christian origin from the 4th century CE. And our oldest manuscripts of the Masoretic text in Hebrew were Masoretic text manuscripts from the 9th century or so, from the Middle Ages. So the oldest manuscripts by far were in Greek, but that didn't mean that the Tanakh was written in Greek. And one of the books, first of all, large portions of the Tanakh have never been discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We only have like tiny fragments of Ezra and Nehemiah and whatnot. But we have none of the book of Esther found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, to this day, the oldest manuscripts we have of the book of Esther are Greek manuscripts of the Septuagint version of the book of Esther, by far. And that does not mean that the book of Esther was originally written in Greek. That's absurd. Of course it wasn't originally written in Greek. We know it wasn't. And yet, by hundreds of years, the oldest manuscripts of the book of Esther that we have are Greek. That itself dispels the entire argument that the oldest manuscripts of New Testament books being Greek would prove that it was originally written in Greek. But even that argument isn't even as solid as you might think as we continue forward. Now, one of the things that people will say is I hear this a lot. We have over 5,000 ancient Greek manuscripts of the books of the New Testament, or of the New Testament. And that statement is false. It is rooted in a truth, so let me explain. And first of all, let's understand what the word ancient means. In history, the word ancient is usually taken to refer to a time prior to the fall of the Roman Empire. So before 500 CE, 4th century or older. Okay? That's what ancient is. And then after that, we have a period we call medieval or Middle Ages. And then we have modern, the modern period. Okay. The vast majority of the 5,000 plus Greek manuscripts of New Testament books are, the vast majority of them are late from the Middle Ages. Only a very small handful of them are ancient. Okay. First of all, I mentioned there's about 100 papyri fragments, but that's like finding a part of a page of a book torn out of a book, maybe the size of my hand, and saying that that's a copy of the book. It's not. Okay. And so we do have these ancient papyri fragments, but as I pointed out, that doesn't really prove the age or the original language. That doesn't really prove the original language of the New Testament, because we also find amongst those same papyri fragments, Greek fragments of books of the Tanakh, Greek fragments of the Septuagint. Okay. And but we don't find among them any Hebrew fragments of the Tanakh. We don't find fragments of the Hebrew text of Isaiah, but we find fragments of the Greek Septuagint text of Isaiah amongst them. Okay, so those fragments really don't prove anything. One of the main things that they do prove is that the arid in hot, arid environment in Egypt was conducive to preserving some of these things. So we start rapidly whittling away at these 5,000 ancient Greek manuscripts when we find out that there aren't 5,000 ancient Greek manuscripts. The vast majority of them are from the Middle Ages. We have, as I mentioned, about 100 fragments, but those fragments aren't really copies of the books either. Okay, they are simply fragments. We do have about 7. When we start talking about complete, and even by complete I'm using the term loosely, because they may be missing some pages, or they may be only the 4 Gospels, but we have approximately 7 complete copies of the New Testament that are ancient, or roughly ancient. And by that I mean 4th to 5th centuries. Okay, let's cover some of those. In fact, a lot of this information that people will use about these 5,000 Greek manuscripts comes from Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which is, by the way, a very useful reference book. But some of this information, as I pointed out, is misleading. So let's talk about these manuscripts. We got Codex Vaticanus, dated 4th century, AD 325 to 350. It's nearly the entire Bible, so it's also got the Septuagint in it, by the way, but not a Hebrew version of the Tanakh. We have Codex Sinaiticus 350, located at the British Museum. It contains most of the New Testament and over half of the Old Testament. We have Codex Alexandrianus, AD 400, which technically is 5th century, and that's probably not an exact date anyway. It's located in the British Museum. It contains almost the entire Bible. There's Codex Ephraimi, which is located in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, France. It's 5th century, and it's its 5th century origin and evidence it supplies make it important text. It contains every book of the New Testament except 2nd Thessalonians and 2nd John, but it's 5th century, which means technically not ancient, but so close that we'll give it a break. Codex Bezae, AD 450 plus. Now that's a very interesting Codex D, is also known as. That's a Western type text. It has amazing agreements with the Aramaic Old Syriac text. But that's the whole Western text type and the relationship to the original Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the New Testament is subject for a whole different video. Then we got Codex Washingtonianus, which is 450, and it contains the 4 Gospels. By the way, Codex Bezae has the 4 Gospels in Greek and Latin. And then Codex Clarimontus, AD 500, so now we're into the 6th century, contains the Pauline epistles. So those are the major unicules, and that's 7, and we actually edge into the 6th century with those. Most of them are from the 5th century, and like 2 or 3 of them maybe to the 4th century. So the 5,000 ancient Greek New Testament manuscripts boils down to really 7, and that's pushing it into the 5th and 6th century when we start talking about complete manuscripts. And 5th and 6th century is technically not ancient. 5th century is maybe questionable. At any rate, now what does that mean? Well, we have another thing about these 5,000 plus manuscripts is that Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, not only cites those 5,000 Greek manuscripts, but it cites 10,000 plus Latin manuscripts. Now, does the existence of 10,000 Latin manuscripts mean that the New Testament was originally written in Latin? Of course not. All right, now let's compare this to the New Testament, the Hebrew and Aramaic. Remember I said that the book of Esther, the oldest copies of the book of Esther we have are 4th century Greek copies of Esther, and that the oldest copies by far are Greek, not Hebrew. Well, in fact, if we take the amount of time that passed, the gap, if you will, in time, from the time period of the book of Esther to our oldest Hebrew text of the book of Esther, we have roughly 1,500 years. Interestingly, if we take the amount of time from the time period of the book of Matthew to our oldest Hebrew manuscripts of the book of Matthew, we're also talking about 1,500 years. So about the same time in between. But let's talk about the Aramaic. We have much older, more ancient evidence for the Aramaic versions of the so-called New Testament. By that I refer to the Old Syriac and the closely related Peshitta versions. We have 2 manuscripts of the Old Syriac that have come down to us. We have the Sinaiticus manuscript of the Old Syriac. They're both of the 4 Gospels only. Codex Sinaiticus dates back to the 4th century, and Codex Curetonius, the other one, dates back to the 5th century CE. Now, this same book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, that says that there are over 5,000 Greek manuscripts and 10,000 Latin manuscripts, acknowledges the two ancient Old Syriac Aramaic manuscripts. It also says that there are 350 Peshitta manuscripts. Now, those 350 manuscripts aren't all ancient by any means. However, we do have several ancient ones. We have manuscript Par Syriac number 296. It's a Latin manuscript written, it's a Aramaic manuscript, it's a Peshitta manuscript written by the same scribe as another codex that's dated to 463 CE. and it contains Luke chapter 6, most of the book of Luke, let's just put it that way. Then we have British Museum ad number 14,459. It's a manuscript dated to the 5th century, and it contains only Matthew and Mark. Manuscripts, British Museum manuscript 17,117. It's 5th century. It contains Matthew and Mark. British Museum manuscript 14,453 is the oldest Peshitta manuscript to contain all 4 Gospels, and it dates to the 5th century, maybe the 6th century, 5th to 6th centuries. There are about 50 manuscripts of the Peshitta that date to the 6th century, by the way. Then there's manuscript Mon Syriac 8. It's a 6th century manuscript of Acts and the Catholic epistles or Jewish epistles, the James, James, 1 Peter, and 1 John. The Peshitta doesn't contain the rest of them. Then there's British Museum ad number 14,473. It's a 6th century manuscript of Acts. I just mentioned that one, sorry. There's British Museum ad number 17,120. It's a 6th century manuscript of Acts and the Jewish epistles. When I say the Jewish epistles, I mean James, 1 Peter, and 1 John. Also, manuscript 17,121 contains the same material. Manuscript British Museum number 14,476 is dated to the 5th or 6th centuries, and it's the manuscript of the Pauline epistles. And then we have British Museum ad number 14,480. It's a manuscript also dated to the 5th or 6th centuries of the Pauline epistles. So the point is that our oldest Aramaic manuscripts of New Testament books, when we start talking about actual complete manuscripts, are in the same time period ballpark as our oldest complete Greek manuscripts of the New Testament books. So you can see that the argument that the oldest manuscripts are in Greek really doesn't hold water, because 1, that doesn't prove the original language, and 2, that only proves which texts were being preserved and copied by ancient Christians. And then 2, the idea that the most manuscripts are in Greek doesn't really prove anything, because there are even more Latin manuscripts, and that doesn't prove the New Testament was originally written in Latin. Okay, so I think we have some good understanding here of the fallacy of the argument that the New Testament must have originally been written in Greek because the oldest manuscripts are in Greek, or because the most manuscripts are in Greek. Hopefully that will help your understanding in the future, and we'll do more videos on this topic of the Hebrew and Aramaic original origin of the New Testament in the future. Please donate to support these videos. We can't do this without you. We really do need your support, and you make these very unique videos possible. And you can do that by clicking on the donate link in the video description, or sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. We also like to ask you to please like this video, subscribe to this channel, Click that notifications bell. Let us know what you think in the comments and participate in the discussions in the comments. All those are things that the YouTube algorithm looks at to decide which videos to recommend to new users, and we want to be recommended to new users. And then please share these videos with your friends on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, etc. Help us get the word out to bring in new viewers, new subscribers. All right, and until next time, everybody, shalom.